The message was not a refusal, it was a dare. It is September 1944. The place is eastern France, where the mud is beginning to cake the tracks of American Sherman tanks. An American messenger stands under a white flag before the thick, scarred walls of a German fortress. Inside, 1,500 men are waiting to die. The American officer has just delivered a standard offer from Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Surrender now, avoid the bloodshed, and live to see the end of the war. The German commander, a major hardened by years of propaganda and the desperate defense of the Reich, does not just say no. He looks the American in the eye and delivers a line that he believes will immortalize him in the annals of military courage. He says, "Tell General Patton that if he wants this fortress, he will have to kill me to get it." It is a statement designed to freeze the blood. It is the ancient code of the warrior, death before dishonor. It is meant to signal a siege that will cost the Americans weeks of time and thousands of lives. But when the messenger returns to 3rd Army headquarters and repeats these words, Patton does not rage. He does not hesitate. He simply nods, his face setting into that familiar grim mask of war, and replies with 4 words that sealed the fate of 1,500 men. "I can arrange that." What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. To understand why this moment happened, we must first understand the desperate friction of September 1944. The summer had been a blur of American speed. After the breakout from Normandy, Patton's Third Army had raced across France faster than any army in history. They had liberated towns before the Germans could even pack their bags. They were an unstoppable wave of steel and gasoline, driving toward the German border with a ferocity that terrified the Wehrmacht. But by September, the momentum was dying. The Allied supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The Red Ball Express trucks were burning enormous amounts of fuel just to deliver fuel to the front. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had to make hard choices about where to send the limited supplies, often prioritizing Montgomery in the north, leaving Patton's tanks sputtering on fumes in the south. For a man like George Patton, this enforced halt was torture. He believed fervently, almost religiously, that the only way to win the war was to never stop moving. Hold him by the nose and kick him in the pants, he would say. Momentum was his armor. If he stopped, the Germans would dig in. If he stopped, the war would turn from a race into a slaughter. And that is exactly what was happening in Lorraine. As the Third Army slowed down, the disorganized German retreat began to harden. They fell back into the old fortifications of eastern France, massive stone and concrete forts built decades, sometimes centuries earlier, to guard the borders. These weren't field trenches. They were complex networks of underground bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and stone walls feet thick, designed specifically to stop an army in its tracks. The fortress in question sat on a critical road junction. In war, logistics is destiny. Patton needed that road to move his supplies. Leaving the fortress in German hands meant diverting convoys onto slower, muddier tracks, losing precious hours that the Third Army did not have. Bypassing it was technically possible, but strategically dangerous. A garrison of 1,500 men behind your lines is a cancer. They can raid your supply trucks, spot for artillery, and harass your rear echelon. Patton knew he had to crack this nut. But he also knew the cost of attacking a fortress head-on. The textbook approach the school's solution called for a siege. You surround the place, you starve them out, you shell them for weeks until their morale breaks. It is a slow, methodical, casualty-verse process. But Patton did not have weeks. He barely had days. The German army was reorganizing. Every hour the Americans wasted staring at stone walls was an hour the enemy used to strengthen the Siegfried Line on the German border. This explains the initial offer of surrender. Contrary to the blood and guts caricature often painted by pop history, Patton was not interested in wasting American lives for sport. He was a pragmatist. A surrendered enemy is a neutralized enemy. If the German major had walked out with his hands up, Patton would have accepted his sword, sent the men to a prisoner of war camp, and had his tanks rolling down that road by noon. It was the efficient, professional move. Why, then, did the German major refuse so dramatically? We must look at the psychological state of the Wehrmacht in late 1944. By this point, the German officer corps was fractured. Some knew the war was lost and were looking for a way out. But others, particularly those commanding independent strongpoints, felt the intense pressure of the NSEG propaganda. They had been told that wonder weapons were coming. They had been told that the Americans were weak, that they lacked the stomach for a real fight. The Major's challenge, "You'll have to kill me," was likely performative. He was performing for his men, trying to stiffen their spines with a display of Teutonic bravery. He was performing for his superiors in Berlin, fearing retribution against his family if he surrendered too easily. And perhaps he was performing for himself, clinging to the romantic ideal of the last stand, because the reality of defeat was too bitter to swallow. He miscalculated. He thought he was starting a negotiation of wills. He didn't realize he was speaking to a man who viewed war not as a negotiation, but as a mathematical equation of violence. When the messenger brought the reply back, the staff at Third Army headquarters might have expected a rage-fueled tirade. Patton was famous for his temper. But the accounts of this day suggest something colder. The eye can arrange that response wasn't shouted. It was stated. It was the closing of a file. The Major had requested death. Very well. The request was approved. Patton turned to his operations officers and orchestrated a symphony of destruction. He did not order a human wave assault. He did not send infantry charging across open ground to be mown down by machine guns. That would be playing the Major's game. Instead, Patton decided to use American industrial superiority to dismantle the fortress, brick by brick, bone by bone. Phase 1. The cage, the first order, was total isolation. American units moved to cut every physical link to the outside world. Phone lines were severed. Water pipes, if found, were destroyed. The fortress was hermetically sealed. This was standard doctrine, but the speed with which it was executed was pure Patton. Within hours, the German garrison was alone. Phase 2. The announcement, then came the psychological blow. Patton ordered loudspeakers brought to the front lines. This is a crucial detail often overlooked in the violence of war. He didn't just start shooting. He told them he was going to start shooting. The loudspeakers broadcast a schedule. At 08:00, the artillery will start. At 1000, the bombers will arrive. At 1200, we come for you. Think of the terror inside those walls. The German soldiers, many of them tired infantrymen or conscripts, listened as a disembodied voice outlined the exact timeline of their demise. The Major had promised them glory. Loudspeakers promised them math. It drove a wedge between the commander and his men. The Major was ready to die, but was the 19-year-old radio operator? Was the father of 3 manning the machine gun? At dawn, the artillery opened up. This was not harassing fire. Patton had massed his corps' artillery, 155 mm long toms and 8-inch howitzers, for a time-on-target mission. The goal was to crack the stone casing of the fort. The German guns tried to answer. This was the moment the Major had hoped for a duel. But the Americans had mastered the art of counter-battery fire. Radar and spotter planes triangulated the German muzzle flashes instantly. Every time a German gun fired, an avalanche of American shells landed on its position minutes later. Silence fell over the German batteries. They realized that to fire was to commit suicide. Then came the air power. 9 Tactical Air Command, Patton's guardian angels, sent in P-47 Thunderbolts. These weren't dropping unguided bombs from high altitude. They were diving to treetop level, skipping 500-pound bombs into the fortress courtyard, blasting the command bunkers, and strafing the firing slits. The P-47 pilots had been briefed on specific targets: the ammunition dump, the command post, the barracks. The fortress shook. Dust and smoke filled the underground corridors. Impregnable walls were being turned into gravel. Inside the command bunker, the German Major was losing control. Reports were coming in that his men were trying to surrender. White flags were popping up in shattered windows. The Major, desperate to maintain his heroic narrative, ordered his officers to shoot anyone attempting to surrender. He was now fighting 2 wars, one against the Americans outside and one against his own sanity inside. This is the fragility of dictatorial leadership. The Major relied on fear to command his men, fear of the enemy and fear of punishment. But Patton had changed the equation. The fear of the American bombardment now outweighed the fear of the Major's pistol. By turning the fortress into a death trap, Patton forced the German soldiers to make a rational choice. The Major offers death. The Americans offer life. The breakdown of discipline wasn't a failure of the soldiers. It was the inevitable result of a commander asking for a sacrifice his men were not willing to make. By early afternoon, the infantry moved in. They didn't charge, swept. Engineers blew apart the remaining obstacles. Sherman tanks rolled right up to the breached walls, their main guns pointing point blank into the bunkers. The resistance was sporadic. Most Germans were dazed, their eardrums shattered by the concussions. They were broken by the realization that their stone walls offered no protection against modern firepower. They emerged from the dust with their hands on their heads, stepping over the rubble of their positions. The major, however, remained true to his word. He had barricaded himself in the ruins of his headquarters with a small cadre of fanatical loyalists. When the American troops kicked down the door, the major did not reach for the sky. He raised his weapon. It was over in a second. It was no final speech. An American sergeant, a man whose name is lost to history but whose reflexes were honed by months of combat, saw the threat and fired. The major fell dead. He had set the terms of the engagement. Patton had met them. The fortress was secured in less than 12 hours. When we analyze this event, it is easy to get swept up in the justice of it. The arrogant commander gets what he asked for. But as historians, we must dig deeper. Was this operation a masterpiece of efficiency, or was it a massacre? From a military standpoint, it was a masterpiece. Patton spent ammunition to save blood. By using overwhelming firepower artillery and air support, he minimized the exposure of his own infantry. American casualties were negligible, a handful of wounded. This validates the American doctrine of the era. Metal is cheaper than blood. However, consider the German perspective. The major's refusal to surrender condemned 200 of his men to death and another 300 to serious injury. These were men who, had the major said yes to the first note, would have survived the war. They would have returned to rebuild Germany. Instead, they died in a hole in France because of one man's ego. This highlights a critical flaw in the German military tradition of World War II. The Führerprinzip leader principle and the cult of self-sacrifice often divorced military decisions from reality. The major believed he was defending honor. In reality, he was defending nothing. The fortress fell anyway. The delay to Patton was insignificant. 12 hours is a blink of an eye in a war of this scale. The major's death achieved nothing tactical, nothing strategic. It was a waste. And what of Patton? His eye can arrange? That is chilling. It reveals a commander who had completely compartmentalized the act of killing. He did not view the major as a human being to be saved, but as an obstacle to be removed. Some might call this callous. But in the context of commanding an army of hundreds of thousands, is it not the highest form of mercy to end a battle quickly? If Patton had hesitated, if he had laid a polite siege, if he had tried to negotiate for days, the Germans might have reinforced the position. The Americans might have lost hundreds of men trying to take the walls. By being brutal, quick, and decisive, Patton likely saved more lives than he took. It is a paradox of war. Sometimes the most violent course of action is the most humane. While this story is satisfying, the clean, linear narrative of a challenge made and a challenge met it is also deceptive. It serves as a microcosm that hides a much darker, messier truth about the autumn of 1944. We must pivot here to discuss what history books often gloss over. The tragedy of Lorraine's 12-hour victory was an anomaly. It was a rare bright spot in what was becoming a nightmare for the Third Army. The reality of the Metz campaign was not quick, and it was not clean. When we tell stories like the eye can arrange that fortress, we inadvertently create a myth that American firepower could solve any problem instantly. But just miles away from this fortress, at places like Fort Dryant, the reality was horrific. Fort Dryant was a similar complex thick walls, underground tunnels. But at Dryant, the eye can arrange that method failed. The walls were too thick for the artillery. The bunkers were too deep for the bombs. American infantrymen were sent into the tunnels, fighting hand-to-hand in the dark with knives and grenades. They were slaughtered. The attack on Fort Dryant had to be abandoned. This was a defeat for Patton. Why does the story of the major and his quick death survive, while the failure at Dryant is often forgotten? Because we crave competency. We want to believe that our generals are infallible and that our enemies are punished for their arrogance. The story of the major fits the script of the righteous war. The story of Dryant where brave Americans died for nothing. In the mud because of poor intelligence and hubris does not. Furthermore, we must look at the psychological toll this period took on Patton himself. During this exact time, September and October 1944, Patton was arguably at his lowest point. His diaries from this period are dark. He felt handcuffed by Eisenhower's supply decisions. He watched the weather turn against him, the rains flooding the Moselle River, turning the battlefields into swamps. The I can arrange that moment was likely a release of pent-up frustration. Patton couldn't strike at Eisenhower, couldn't strike at Montgomery, but he could strike at this major. This one German officer became the focal point for all of Patton's rage against the stalling war. The overwhelming violence unleashed on that fortress wasn't just tactical, it was emotional. It was Patton screaming at the universe that he was still the master of the battlefield, even as the broader strategic situation was slipping out of his control. This adds a layer of tragedy to the German major's fate. He wasn't just fighting the Third Army, he was standing in front of a frustrated general who needed a win. He was the wrong man in the wrong place. He was offering the wrong challenge to a man who was desperate to prove that he could still crush his enemies. The immediate consequence of the battle was the opening of the road. The supplies flowed, the trucks moved, the Third Army inched forward. But the ripple effects were more profound. Word of the fortress's destruction spread through the German lines. This was the terror component of Patton's strategy. He wanted the Germans to know that surrendering to the Third Army was safe, but fighting the Third Army was suicide. Intelligence reports from later in the campaign show a shift in German behavior. When isolated garrisons were surrounded, American negotiators would often simply point to the smoking ruins of the last fortress and say, "Do you want to be next?" The memory of the major's folly saved lives in future engagements. It gave German commanders a permission structure to surrender. "I cannot fight Patton. He will vaporize us." However, it also stiffened the resolve of the SS and the true fanatics. Knowing that Patton brought total destruction, some units fought with the desperation of doomed men, knowing there was no middle ground. It polarized the battlefield. For the American troops, this event solidified their faith in old blood and guts. Soldiers will follow a commander who they believe can kill the enemy. Seeing the fortress smashed so efficiently boosted morale at a time when the cold and the mud were sapping the army's spirit. It reinforced the narrative that they were part of a winning machine. The fortress in eastern France is long gone. The rubble has been cleared or overgrown by 80 years of French ivy. The road junction is likely a paved roundabout now, with cars driving over the spot where the major made his last stand. The driver is oblivious to the violence that once consumed that ground, but the question the major asked remains relevant. "You will have to kill me." It is the ultimate challenge of the fanatic. And the answer Patton gave, "I can arrange that," remains the ultimate answer of the total warrior. This story forces us to look in the mirror. We'd like to think of World War II as a war of liberation, of candy bars and cheering crowds. And it was. But it was also a war of industrial extermination. It was a war where a decision was made to obliterate a square mile of earth because a single man refused to bow. The major's death was not a tragedy of circumstance. It was a tragedy of choice. He chose the symbol over the reality. He chose the gesture over the responsibility. And in doing so, he taught us a lesson that echoes in every conflict since. When you face a force that has the capacity and the will to destroy you, defiance is not a strategy. It is merely a complicated form of suicide. Patton didn't hate the major. He likely respected him in a professional sense. But respect in war does not mean mercy. It simply means delivering the end you promised with as much efficiency as possible. The major got his wish. He died defending his post. Patton got his road. The war moved on, indifferent to them both. And somewhere in a military cemetery, there is a headstone for a man who learned too late that you should be very careful what you dare a general to do. Because sometimes he will say yes.